Hey there, all my friends out there. This is the Mad Professor again with you, Dr. John. And as usual, from my fabulous penthouse suite in Iraq. So I think today I want to kind of give some, not a deep dive, but a kind of a review of America's history with Canada. In a future episode, I'll talk about America's history with Mexico. But Canada is a particularly interesting case because I grew up in the United Kingdom, in London, where I went to primary school and basically what Americans would call middle school. And so I learned history from a very English perspective. And then I went to high school in the United States, and then I learned history from a very American perspective. At the same time, keep in mind that as a child, I knew I was American, although I spoke with a proper British accent. And kind of as a result, I have a little bit of a look on both sides, but also a bias on both sides because in both cases I was a little. I had an alternate mind view of the information being given me. In England, I kind of questioned the material because I'm like, hold it here, this is only one side of it because I was different from everybody. I had the opposite side of the story. And in America, the same thing. In America, I was kind of looking at things from like, hold it, does this include the British perspective? So as a result of having these two different perspectives as I was growing up, I was always, I wouldn't say hypercritical, but critical in the sense that I looked at things and I questioned them in a way that I think a lot of people maybe didn't do when they were in school because they only had one story being drilled into them all the time. On the other hand, neither English people nor Americans really know what to make of Canada. And I hate to say this to my Canadian friends, but Canadians are an enigma because people look at them like English people look at Canadians like, well, aren't they just British people who happen to live on the other side of the Atlantic? And Americans, of course, look at Canadians like, aren't they just like us, except they happen to be in a place called Canada, and neither of them really have a full understanding, historical context of this. I don't know if the same will be true of places like Australia and New Zealand or other British colonies, but I think Canada, in particular, I don't know what their sense of self identity is, but in terms of the perspective have of them, it's kind of like, well, they're just like us, except maybe slightly different, right? So that doesn't mean understanding. I mean, it may seem like a friendly thing to say. It's like, oh, you're just like me. But when you're not just like somebody else, it's kind of insulting for people to say that you are like them, right? So if somebody comes up to you and they say, well, you're just like me. We have the same interests. We have the same concerns. And you're like, well, I don't know. Who are you? So, just very brief kind of review background from an American perspective of Canada. Um, so, first of all, in America, what we learn in America is that we're a republic. We became independent. We had a revolution, right? And we stood up to evil King George III and the British Parliament, and we said no taxation without and of course, as every country glorifies and mythologizes its past, everything American was brilliant, right? The Constitution and the founding fathers and George Washington and John Hancock, and we see the revolution as this act of um, supreme humanity, and in some ways, certainly, it was tempered with the liberalism of the era, the ideals of humanism and of li- individual liberties, the rejection of the old systems of monarchy and feudalism. So yes, there was a lot to be said for that. On the other hand, there was also a lot of other things. I mean, a lot of reasons why the U.S. colonies really broke from the English, from the British colony, from the British Empire, I should say, is that first of all, the British Empire was controlling the trade. The Americans wanted to be able to manage their own trade. Also, the British Empire controlled the borders. Americans wanted to expand their borders. The British did not want to have any more trouble with Native Americans, and they preferred to basically prevent expansion of the colonies. Uh, there was a big bloody war in 1760s called the French Indian War in the United States. We call it that, and in Britain they call it that because this was a war between the British Empire and France, in which the Native Americans played, tried to basically maintain their independence by siding with one side or the other side. So some Indian tribes sided with the British, other Indian tribes sided with the French. Obviously, it created a lot of havoc on the border regions. Um, and ultimately, the British won this war and they took over the French colonies in the Americas, particularly Quebec. Um, So this created a paradox, and this was about 10 to 15 years before the American Revolution occurred. It spurred the revolution because now the British colonists, those who were living in the Americas, particularly the ones on the Atlantic seaboard, what we now call the American states, the original 13 states, colonies that became states, they really wanted to start expanding westward into Indian territory, right? They also wanted to control their own trade. A lot of them were merchants, they were sea shipbuilders. They wanted to control their own trade, whereas the British Empire wanted to keep them kind of within patterns of, monopoly markets that would benefit the British Empire and the economy back in England primarily. Um, so there was a lot of tension, and the other issue, of course, was slavery. Because even though slavery existed throughout the British Empire, um, most of it was centered in the Caribbean and the Southern American colonies, right? So these were areas where you could grow crops like sugar and cotton and tobacco, and these crops were particularly labor intensive, involving very, very harsh conditions, right? So you weren't going to find British uh, people from Britain or Europe migrating to America to take these jobs. They were horrible, horrible jobs, right? Plus, they were best cultivated under what they were called plantation, or basically agricultural factory conditions, right, with very strict regulation of the workforce. So it was very hard to find quote unquote free labor. In other words, people volunteering to do this kind of work for a salary, right? For a while, they would bring people over and they would make them servants for 7 years, right? Bonded, they were called bonded servants. So they were held in bond, like a mortgage for 7 years, right? And at the end of the 7 years, they could leave, right? So the problem with this system is that, first of all, a lot of them would try to escape ahead of time. Secondly, when they left, they were supposed to be given land, right? So the people who bought them, you know, didn't necessarily benefit if they survived their 7 years of servitude. So there wasn't a hell of a lot of, as you say, motivation to keep them happy or even keep them alive, right? So this is why in these southern states and the Caribbean colonies turned to use of black slaves, specifically African slaves. Now I'll go into a discussion of slavery at some other time. I'm not going to go into this now. Obviously, this is very important to the future history of the United States and the whole region. But right now, I just want to focus on the Canadian part. And there weren't. In the North, you didn't have these types of agriculture. You didn't have the conditions for tobacco or sugar cane. It was too cold, or cotton. right? It was too cold. These things required warm, humid climates. It was anywhere north of what they called the Mason-Dixon line, which basically means above Virginia. You didn't have conditions for that. So if you had any slaves in the early colonial period, they would be maybe house servants or maybe working on the farm along with the family, and the relationships would be very, very different, right? They were not considered brute force labor, right, as they were in the South. So, okay. So I don't want to get caught up in issues of slavery right now, as I said. Anyway, so you didn't have this issue of slavery as much when you were in the northern areas or in Canada, for certainly, right? So in these areas, this is where the free, quote unquote, free migrants from England and Europe would come, and they would come, and maybe they'd be given land, or maybe they would just find cheap land, or maybe they would find a job. But the point is, this labor was then available to fuel other forms of agriculture, such as growing of crops, uh, fisheries, uh, shipping, early factory work, and things like that. So you saw in the northern U.S. what became the U.S. colonies, such as New England, New York, to some extent Virginia. Here you saw the beginnings of industrialization, right? Now, Canada in these years, as I said before, with the French Indian Wars, England just conquered Quebec. So it only just got Canada. It was very underpopulated except for the French areas, right? So this was the first thing that made Canada very different, right? First of all, its deep French heritage, and one part of that is that the French, of course, were Catholic, right? Whereas most of the Americans in the colonies that became the United States were Protestants, and very fiercely so, right? Freedom of religion was not an early part of the colonial experience. The only colony that was explicitly Catholic was Maryland, right? Named Mary for Queen Mary, who was a Catholic queen. So you have a situation now where already, even before the American Revolution begins, there are very few what you call Anglo Canadians. Most of the Canadians were French Canadians, right? So there was a huge cultural and language breach between the American colonies that eventually became independent, became the United States, and the Canadian colonies, right? So this was the early difference. So when the American colonies started their revolutionary fervor, right, in the 1770s, basically, right? They put out a call to everybody and said, let's all get together and talk about the terrible things King George was doing, which was basically to raise taxes to recoup the costs of the French Indian Wars and other things, right? There was the stamp tax, there was this tax, the other tax, and people don't like paying taxes. And then also these colonists said, hold it here, we don't have any representation in Parliament, right? It takes 3 months just to sail across, so it doesn't make any sense to have elections and send a member over to Parliament. But even so, I mean, why don't we have any say, right? In the original colonies, each colony had a house of burgesses or whatever, assembly or whatever they called it, and they kind of managed many of their own affairs and raised taxes for their local needs. But the king just coming down and saying, "Give me money, I want money," right? And then, of course, the British also tried to control trade, which led to things like the Boston Tea Party, because the British only allowed the British East India Company to trade and things like that. So, anyway, long story short, they brought these colonies together. They did reach out to the Canadians in several moments, but basically they got nothing back, right? In terms of the Caribbean, they also really didn't make any connections. So that's why we had these original 30 colonies out of what was, I believe, at that time, 25 colonies or provinces altogether in the Americas, right? When I say America, I'm talking about the continent, right? Primarily North America, actually speaking, right? So the 13 colonies that we all know and love that became the United States of America and bonded together and had the Revolutionary War, I'm not going to list them all because maybe I'll get them wrong and then everybody will make fun of me. But anyway, we all know what they are, who they are figuratively, right? So they staged this revolution. Now, this is the thing about revolutions, right? Not everybody's in agreement in a revolution. Some people, they called them the patriots or the Whigs, right? Was the term they called them at the time. Don't ask me why. Maybe because they wore a wig. I don't know. Right? I think it refers to some person in the past. Anyway, the Whigs were wanted to get rid of the king. They wanted to cease being a colony. They wanted to become an independent country, in some form or another. Right? But you had a lot of people who were still loyal to the king. Maybe they had come over relatively recently, or maybe they just had long traditional roots. Maybe they honored the king, country, blah. Their country was England, or Britain at least, right? Many were Scots and Irish and Welsh too, right? Not all English by any means, right? So some of those people were genuinely what we would call loyalists. They were loyal to the king. Sorry, the Whigs were the patriots. The loyalists were the Tories. They were loyal to the king, right? So it wasn't like everybody rose up. No, you had all these little fights going on. And the British, for a long time, held most of the American colonies through local militias of loyalists, right? I won't go into a long palaver about it, but basically, they kind of screwed up on the public relations element and, fuck around and find out, right? They brutalized some of the wrong people. They turned public opinion against them. The loyalists started to move out. Basically, they could see that they were, not wanted, right? The patriots were also, according to a lot of stories, somewhat over, unruly, I should say, right? So eventually 60,000 of those loyalists, the ones who were loyal to the king, left, right? They left these colonies when they were becoming independent because they did not want to leave the British Empire, right? Most of those people, where did they go? They went to Canada. And they became kind of the bedrock of the Canadian ideology today, right? So they were loyal to the crown, but they were also colonists, right? And keep in mind, fervently anti-American. I'm not saying they necessarily hated America, but they left America. They did not have happy memories. They did not agree with America. They did not agree with the American Republic, right? Now, I hope some Canadian maybe watching this might make any corrections or comments from their own perspective, right? My impression is that Americans don't understand this, right? In American history books, the ones I read in high school particularly, they don't mention any of this, right? They don't mention how many loyalists went to Canada and how they were literally forced out. They were refugees, right? Talk to somebody who's a refugee, a Palestinian refugee, or some other refugee who's been forced out of their country by somebody else. They're not happy, and it takes them a long time to get used to it, right? And then we have another thing happen, right? In 1812, and again, this is something I found the British history textbooks really glazed over. They really Of course, I was younger in England at that time, so maybe it was a function of the age that the textbooks were put at. But I really don't remember any discussion of the 1812 war. Now, I knew about it because I was an American. My mother was American. She would always remind us about how great America was and how much it was better than England and blah, 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 right? But I don't remember anything in those history textbooks about the 1812. Maybe there was a brief mention somewhere, right? But when you got to America, and again, I was in high school, again, the history talked about America versus Britain No discussion of Canada whatsoever, right? Almost all the focus was on the frigates, right? The frigate battles in which the Americans did fairly well, considering they were facing the most powerful navy in the world at that time, right? Or at least parts of it, because most of the British fleet was focusing on Napoleon in France at that time. You have to be honest here, right? But what frigates they had, and the American fleet at that time was didn't even exist. They had to build it overnight. And then, of course, they talk about the Great Lakes battles, where the American built a fleet that defeated the British fleet on the Great Lakes between America and Canada. But they don't mention a couple incidents. First of all, in the American textbooks, I distinctly remember reading about how the British sacked and burnt Washington, D.C., right? What those history textbooks didn't mention is that the Americans had previously sacked and burned the Canadian capital of Yorktown. So the Americans are like, oh, these British, they just came and they burned down our capital, and how dare they? Whereas they're like, they don't mention, hold it, but last year you burned down our capital, which is, what's that word? Reciprocity, right? We're just claiming reciprocity here, buddy. Oh, sorry, I should have said that. We're just claiming reciprocity here, my chap. So anyway, this is the thing about history, right? Every country creates its own mythology and its own legends, and they'll create a history to make themselves look like, well, we're always the good guys, and we only fight when we have to protect ourselves against enemy, and we always win all the battles. Well, the most important battles, anyway. Anyway, there were two besides Yorktown, where the Americans did get to Yorktown, which is now called Toronto. You might have heard of it. And they go into Yorktown and they burn. They didn't burn the whole city like the Americans did. They were a bit more targeted. They just burned the government buildings, I believe. Although, again, maybe some Canadian has a different point of view. Um, Another battle. This I only found out about it because I was driving through Ontario. I believe Ontario, between Detroit and Niagara Falls, if I'm correct. And there's a causeway. You go through that Canadian section there, and the causeway is called the Queen Elizabeth II Boulevard or Road, maybe I forget. It's like a freeway, right? And in the middle, I was very surprised. We stop off at a battlefield, right? And I believe it was the Stony Creek battlefield, um, because that's approximately where that battlefield was, right? Stony Creek is next to the town of Hamilton. And what's significant about that battle from the Canadian point of view is they were like, here's where we stop the Americans, right? Literally, right? With a platoon of militia, we stop this huge American army. And it was a pretty dramatic British or slash Canadian victory. Of course, Canada at that time was just still a colony. But keep in mind, many of the soldiers were local militia or locally conscripted troops. Some of the officers were also Canadian. So even though it was part of the Royal British Empire Army, it was really British slash Canadian, right? They were defending their own territory. The Americans had 3,500 troops in the field. The British Canadians had 700. So it was a very mismatched force. But a couple, military secrets that I won't divulge. The British slash Canadians managed to surprise the Americans. They reconnoitered them and they found out that they were really badly positioned. Right, the American generals, basically most of the American generals who invaded were idiots. Right, I have to say it. The British actually had better generals, which is really surprising for that. For the British. Usually, the British Empire had really bad generalship, But you keep in mind that the British Empire had been fighting a war with France for the last 10, 15 years. So they had had time to hone up their officer corps and get rid of the fluff. Whereas the Americans, basically, they had a few old dodgers from the old Revolutionary War who were just about ready to die, and then a bunch of young people who had no idea what they were doing and just wanted to run off and start shooting at everybody. So there was a mismatch. Anyway, the Canadians managed to rout the Americans by a surprise attack. They captured a large number of Americans. They captured, I believe, both of the American generals leading the American force. Basically, it was a rout. It was a disaster. Anyway, why do I bring this up? Because again, this emphasizes, the point that even at that time, the Americans, when they started the 1812 war, supposedly, the American history, high school history textbook will tell you it's because the British kept stopping our ships and taking sailors off for their war against Napoleon, right? And there were a few incidents of that where the British would stop an American ship, and basically, if British sailors escaped their ships and they found an American ship, the Americans would be like, "Oh, let me sign you on because we need sailors," right? And then the British would come along later and they'd say, "Hey, you've got some of our sailors who are what do you call that? Runaways. No, there's no, AWOL, right? Absent without leave, right? And they would grab them, right? And probably there was a lot of questionable tactics used, right? It wasn't polite and it wasn't proper conduct. The British, of course, felt they were in the right. The Americans felt they were. In any case, the Americans declared war over this. So you'd say, oh, really? They didn't declare a war against the British freaking Empire over a few ships being stopped and English convicts basically being taken away by the English on the open sea in international waters, right? Yeah, technically you could say, but you don't start a war. There were a lot of issues, right? Again, there was the issues of trade. The British Empire was trying to control trade. The Americans wanted to have more trade rights. Again, trade, it's a big factor. So what happened in the end of this story, right? Actually, the beginning, right? Again, another argument is some Americans were convinced the Canadians were just like us. They really want to join us. They don't like being British subjects. They want to be free like us Americans, right? So when they walked into Canada on these attacks, they assumed that flocks of Canadians would be joining them and marching with them to get rid of the British, right? Death to the British, right? And they were wrong, right? Again, the point is they did not understand, even at that time, maybe never had a proper understanding of what Canada was like, right? I'll talk more about Mexico in another episode, right? Obviously, we have a long, contentious history also with Mexico. But Americans are at least aware that Mexico is a different place, right? They speak a different language, they look different, right? Their roads are different, their houses are, when you go to Mexico, you're in Mexico, right? Unless maybe you're in South Texas, then you might not know which country you're in, right? Because there are a lot of Hispanics in the United States as well, right? But generally speaking, most Americans are at least aware that Mexico is a separate place. I looked it up. There are 36 in 2023. There were 36.7 million Americans went to Mexico, and that's like 10% of the American population. This maybe some of those were multiple visits, right? So that means a lot of Americans go there. They know about it. They know it's a different place. Whereas Canada, I give you another figure. How many people went to Canada in 2023? Only 12.7 million, right? Even though Canadians speak English, right? So you'd think it's a lot easier to go there. You just drive across the border, right? There's no fear, right? But you see, they go to Mexico for the beaches. You don't have Cancun in Canada. I'm sorry. Even if you're Canadian, you got to admit that. Ain't no Cancun in Canada, right? Or Acapulco, or places where you can get drunk as a skunk and fall asleep on the beach. Anyway, so this is why people are aware of the differences. They're not aware of the differences with Canada. They go to Canada, the houses look the same, the countryside looks the same. It's at least very similar to northern U.S. Right? 90% of Canadians live within 50 miles of the U.S. border. So Americans just assume these are just Americans, just like us. Now, like I said before, when you assume somebody's just like you, that may seem like really, oh, that's very liberal of you, right? Oh, that's very nice of you to assume the people. But you know what? Actually, isn't very nice because maybe they're not like you. Maybe they don't like the same things you like. It's like when you bring your wife, like, here, I bought you for your birthday a set of golf clubs, and your wife's like, I don't play golf. Well, I thought you were just like me. You want equality, right? It's like, duh, right? No, you have to. True, true equality or empathy means understanding that the other person is different from you, not the same as you, right? You're both human, but you have different cultures, right? Just because they speak English, and again, a lot of Americans is very surprising. Think English is something that only Americans have, right? They don't really understand that English is a language derived from England, right? And the reason Canadians and Americans both speak English is because we both derived from that original native land, at least in terms of our language, right? So Americans just don't understand what makes Canada or Canadians different from Americans. And, maybe a bit of a jab, but I mean, maybe part of it also is the Canadians are not as loud as Americans are, right? Americans are like, I'm an American. We believe in peace and justice in the American way, and nobody loves peace and justice like we do, right? Whereas Canadians, they don't talk much about where they're from or how great Canada is or singing the national anthem. Oh, they don't. I mean, they save that for their hockey games, maybe. I don't know, right? Anyway, so when we think about that, right, and you think about Trump trying to say, "Oh, Canada isn't a real country. They're just an extension of the United States, right? They're the 51st state. Oh, they got great stuff. They're wonderful people. They should become American, just like us." They don't understand how insulting that is, right? Imagine if you're an American and an English person comes over to you and it's like, oh, why don't you become part of the empire, accept the Queen as your monarch and all that good stuff because you're just like us, aren't you? You think an American would put up with that? So why do you expect a Canadian to put up with an American giving them the same bullshit? Right? And the reason, again, this has gone on far too long, I'm afraid. But again, I'm coming back to this theme that Trump has of bringing Canada into the United States, right? And how similar this is to the arguments Putin made about absorbing or annexing Ukraine, right? What has he said? Well, most Ukrainians speak Russian, so that proves they're Russians. Well, no. First of all, a lot of Ukrainians don't speak Russian. And if they do, it's because they were occupied by Russia, basically under the Soviet Union, for 60, 70 years, right? So just because you're occupied and you're forced to learn a different language doesn't destroy your culture and your origins, right? Now, it's true, in that period, a lot of Russians were migrated, some forcefully by Stalin, into Ukraine, right? And by that's how one reason he tried to control the area. This is the Soviet Union. Did this with all their satellite republics. They would ship in masses of Russians, so that the Russians would basically create a control over the local population, right? So That was Putin's argument. Oh, they're just Russians. There's no such thing as Ukraine. I knew a Russian. She was a Ukrainian Russian, right? She was a Russian who was born in Ukraine. Very funny story in a way. But in fact, her part of her family was Ukrainian, apparently. But she hated Ukraine, right? For whatever psychological reason, she hated Ukraine. She loved Putin. She would say things like, Ukrainian isn't even a language. They don't have words for helicopter. It's like, duh, who has a word for helicopter? Something that invented 60 years ago. Even the word helicopter is not related to English even, right? It's heli. That's Greek, right? It's ancient Greek, right? So this was their argument. This is Putin's argument. These people, this is not a real culture. This is not a real country. They don't have a real language. They don't deserve to exist, right? How much more it is with you Canadians, most of whom speak English with virtually the same accent as New Englanders, essentially, right? A little bit different, a couple A's in there, right? He's also been saying that Trudeau he's a governor, right? It's a joke he made. He said, "Oh, I joked to him that he was a governor." Right? How insulting is that? You're going to take a foreign that that in itself is a declaration of war, right? This is symbolic. When you use people's titles, when they're a leader of a country, you have to use their title or it's a deadly insult, right? He called Trudeau a governor, right? Meaning that he's below, underneath, right? It's like an emperor coming in and saying, you're just a sub king. You're just one of my local chieftains, right? And if you agree, now you're a subject, right? Now you're part of the empire. And if you disagree, you have to fight, right? Now Trudeau should have slapped him in the face, but he didn't. Trudeau's very polite. But you don't joke like that in diplomatic circles, right? He keeps talking about how Canada needs the protection of the United States. He needs this. Of course, he says this about everybody, right? Oh, everybody's being protected. We're protecting everybody. We're subsidizing every. Well, there is some truth to that, right? The U.S. has this huge military, right? So on paper, we're spending a lot of money. That's then, an umbrella force in NATO, right, and other CETO and other alliances. But you don't think the U.S. is doing this as a purely noble gesture? You don't think the U.S. is doing this actually to save money, right? Imagine how much money we would have to spend if all these other countries were enemies, which is what Trump wants to make them into, right? Then we'd really have to have a massive military, right? Instead, we have a military that works in alliance with other militaries. Maybe they should pay more, or maybe they should put up more of their own budget for the military force, But you don't just go around telling people that they're being subsidized. You don't do that, right? It's not just an insult, right? People say, "Oh, well, he's crude." No, he's not crude. He's deliberately making a demeaning point. And when you do that in international relations, again, you are subverting the moral order, right? And creating conditions for war, right? And he has not quite, I don't think, I haven't seen any evidence. I mean, one of Putin's big arguments about his invasion of Ukraine is that they were being led by Nazis, right? That he was going to liberate the Ukrainians from the Nazis, from their Nazi regime, right? This was, of course, complete and utter BS, right? Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is a Jew, right? He's no more Nazi than Charlie Chaplin, right? But again, the truth doesn't matter when you get into propaganda because you keep repeating, and you notice the White House uses the same techniques of other propaganda regimes like Goebbels in Nazi Germany, or the Russian uh, propaganda ministry. Right? They'll just repeat the same lie again and as if it's fact, right? And then when you're listening to it, you'll be like, well, it has to be true. Otherwise, why would they say it, right? It's like when somebody looks at the sky and they tell you, wow, the sky is deep red today. And you're looking at it, it's like, well, it looks blue to me, but he says it with such conviction. It must be true. Maybe there's something wrong. Is it you or is it my lying eyes? Right? Something wrong with it looks blue to me, but maybe it's red. Right? Because when they keep saying it with such authority, and you notice in the White House they have that horrible woman she will just say these, and of course this is true throughout the Trump regime, right? Always the press secretaries will just stand up like the first thing they said in the first term, right? The press secretary goes, "We had the biggest crowd in in all inauguration history." It's like, who the fuck cares how big your crowd was? Nobody had even said anything, but he was like insistent and he's so clear. Now the only reason, yeah, I think a lot of people believe him, right? And they come up to me and they say, "Oh, he has huge crowds and all of his," and you show them the pictures. It's like, no, this is the picture of his crowd. And it was tiny. And they'll be like, "Wow, no, that picture's fake, right? It's fake news, right?" So what is Trump calling? He's constantly attacking the press. Everything's fake news. They've got alternative facts, right? Yeah, you might say the sky is blue, but I have alternative facts. The sky is really red, right? It's just in your mind it's blue because there's something wrong with you. Maybe we should take you to someplace, right? Now, occasionally, as Trump has mentioned something else, which is very true and probably the very real reason why he wants to take over Canada, which is resources. Canada has tons and tons of natural resources and not a huge population, right? So, a population about the fifth the size of the United States, but it has probably 80 to 90% of the level of natural resources: oil, gas, timber, all kinds of stuff. What they don't have is a lot of arable land, right? They can't grow a lot because it's too cold up north, right? But they have fishing rights up the gazoo. And with global warming, which of course doesn't exist, right? But now, miraculously, there's no ice cap in the Arctic. So shipping, it could become a massive shipping between United States, Europe, and Russia, right? It's going to bring the world together. So this is with global warming, this is going to become the logistical hub of the freaking globe, right? Forget the Atlantic, forget the Pacific. They're just going to be hopping straight back and forth between Siberia and northern Canada and Greenland, another country Trump is very interested in, right? So Trump is not stupid. I keep saying this. He is not stupid, right? He knows exactly what he's doing. He may not remember the right word in the right time, but he's not stupid, and he wants a war. This is why I tell people, you want to prevent a war, you have to take away the War Powers Act. You have to take away the president's ability to send troops into harm's way. And unless you do that, we are going to be at war within a year. Right? Famous last predictions, I'm sure. Anyway, I've gone far beyond my regular time. If you please comment below, particularly if you're Canadian and you have alternative facts about Canada. Also, please like, subscribe, share if you find this interesting. Have a good night.